When James, a black patient, was denied treatment by arrogant Dr. Alexander due to racism, he left quietly. Days later, James became the clinic's director, forcing Alexander to face the consequences. Dr. Alexander was the embodiment of cold professionalism. Tall and slim, with neatly styled dark hair flecked with gray, he wore an impeccably clean white coat that emphasized his strictness and demand for excellence. At 45, after years of working at the clinic, he had developed the habit of keeping emotions at bay. His gray-blue eyes rarely showed anything but calm indifference, and his sharp facial features highlighted the restraint he was proud of. His reputation was flawless. Patients and colleagues knew Alexander was strict but fair. The office where he saw patients mirrored his personality, perfectly organized, with neatly stacked folders, a clean desk, and minimalist decor. Everything spoke of order and discipline. Alexander was seated at his large wooden desk, shuffling papers, when the door opened slightly, revealing James, an elderly man of about 60, hunched over in pain from his back. Black, with kind but tired eyes, he looked modest and was dressed in a simple yet neat suit, which reflected his respect for the clinic visit. "Take a seat," Alexander said coldly, without looking up from the documents in front of him. He paid no attention to James, treating him like just another patient on his long list. James, slightly embarrassed, didn't sit down. He smiled politely, and feeling the pain in his back worsen, asked for help. "Doctor, I have severe back pain. I really need your assistance." But Alexander, showing no interest in his words, merely sighed irritably, and without turning around said, "Unfortunately, I can't help you. I have too many patients today." For Alexander, this was a standard dismissal. He was busy and didn't plan to waste time on someone he deemed an insignificant patient. He was used to valuing his time and reputation, placing work and status above human empathy. James froze for a moment, surprised by the attitude, but quickly regained his composure. He wasn't used to such treatment, but deep down knew there was no point in arguing. Quietly leaving the office, he closed the door behind him, leaving Alexander buried in his paperwork. Alexander didn't even watch him leave, thinking the matter was settled. A few days after Alexander had dismissively refused to help James, changes began to sweep through the clinic. It started with patient complaints. People were talking about longer waiting times and how the clinic's atmosphere had deteriorated. Angry whispers about the clinic no longer meeting its high standards were becoming more common in the halls. Among the staff, rumors of impending changes started to circulate. Staff members whispered behind closed doors, avoiding open discussions at work. The air was thick with tension, as if every move was being scrutinized. And then, unexpectedly, the news came. The clinic was getting new management. No official statements had been made yet, but rumors spread quickly. Everyone was waiting for the new director to arrive. Alexander, however, felt untouchable. He was sure his reputation as a strict but effective doctor would protect him. He didn't expect the changes to affect him in any way. He always maintained strict discipline and demanded the same from his colleagues. But when it came time to meet the new director, his confidence began to waver. On the day of the scheduled meeting, Alexander entered the conference room, fully expecting to hear only formalities and then go back to work as usual. The doors of the conference room closed quietly behind him, and he immediately noticed the figure sitting at the table. The person wore a perfectly tailored suit, with a neat leather briefcase on the desk. But none of that mattered once Alexander saw his face. He recognized him right away. It was James, the same patient he had refused to help a few days earlier. Now, sitting in front of Alexander, was not just a patient, but his new boss. James appeared calm and confident. His calmness contrasted sharply with the wave of panic that hit Alexander. How was this possible? "Good morning, Dr. Alexander," James said with a slight, almost friendly smile, meeting the stunned doctor's eyes. "I'm your new director." Alexander stood frozen in place, feeling a wave of shame and shock wash over him. He couldn't believe his eyes. The man he had dismissed as insignificant, whom he had refused to help, was now running the clinic. In that moment, everything Alexander had valued, his status, his confidence, his professionalism, collapsed in an instant. Alexander, always confident in his professional infallibility, suddenly found the ground slipping from under him. With each passing day, his self-assuredness crumbled, and the cause was James, the new director of the clinic. Despite their previous encounter, when Alexander had refused to help him, James showed no sign of resentment. On the contrary, James remained purely professional, always polite, calm, and fair. But it was his calmness and composure that became unbearable for Alexander, a constant reminder of his own failure. Every morning, as Alexander came to work, he felt a growing inner tension. He knew that James noticed him, but there was no mention of the past. Yet this silence was what tormented Alexander the most. James seemed to hold up an invisible mirror, forcing Alexander to repeatedly relive the moment when he, believing himself superior to others, had ignored the needs of a patient. And now that patient was leading the clinic. During a staff meeting, James delivered a speech that made Alexander fully grasp the magnitude of his mistake. Standing at the podium, James's calm and confident voice echoed through the hall. "We aim to make the clinic more open and accessible to everyone," James began, slowly looking over the staff. "Here, everyone should feel important. No one should feel secondary." These words seemed to penetrate deep into Alexander's soul. Though they weren't a direct accusation, they sounded like a reproach in his mind. He understood that this was exactly how James had felt when Alexander had dismissed him without even looking in his direction. To Alexander, the entire hall seemed to freeze. Although the speech was addressed to the entire team, every word seemed directed solely at him. At that moment, he felt a profound shame for his past behavior. Alexander's inner conflict consumed him. On one hand, he had always strived to be a professional and pursue perfection. But on the other, his coldness and indifference toward people had revealed his weakness. He began to wonder, how could a doctor, sworn to help people, allow himself to behave in such a way? Each morning now started with new thoughts about how to correct his mistakes, but he couldn't find an answer. James, without showing any signs of the past, continued to do his job with the same calmness and fairness, reminding Alexander that professionalism wasn't just about flawless performance, but also about treating every person with respect. A few weeks after his confidence was shattered by the realization of his mistakes, Alexander decided to take a difficult step. He approached James directly. He had been preparing for this moment for a long time. The internal tension had been building each day, but he understood that an apology was necessary to restore not only his reputation as a doctor, but also as a person. Gathering his courage, Alexander went to James's office. His heart was beating faster than usual, and his palms were slightly sweaty. When he knocked, a calm voice answered, "Come in." Alexander entered the office, which, like James himself, was neat and organized. James was seated at his desk, reading some papers, but when Alexander approached, he set them aside and looked up at him. The room was silent, broken only by Alexander's restrained breathing. His embarrassment was obvious, but despite this, he was determined to say what he had long wanted to. "I want to apologize for my behavior in the past," he began, trying to speak confidently, though his voice trembled slightly. "I was wrong. I now understand how important it is to show respect to every patient, no matter the circumstances." After his words, silence hung in the air. James looked at Alexander carefully, processing what he had heard. He didn't rush to respond, and the wait felt like an eternity for Alexander. Finally, James nodded slightly, and a warm smile appeared on his face. "Admitting your mistakes is the first step toward change, Dr. Alexander," James said calmly, but with deep conviction. "We're here to heal people, not judge them." Those simple words, spoken without reproach, carried a deep meaning. Alexander felt the tension that had been building over the past weeks start to ease. James held no grudge, made no accusations. This made Alexander see the situation differently. In his mind, James was no longer just the patient he had refused to help. He had become the person who taught him an important lesson, a lesson in humanity and respect. From that moment, their relationship changed. Alexander now saw James not only as a boss, but as someone who had helped him look at his work from a new perspective. This experience became a significant turning point for Alexander, changing his approach to both his work and people.